welcome everybody to, I guess, the first lunchtime of Dreamforce 2018. We're here to learn how to delight our sales teams by working with webhooks. We're going to be looking at how to automatically create leads and contacts from code. So I'm Pat Patterson. I'm a technical director at Streamsets. I'll tell you in a moment or two a little bit about them. And before Streamsets, up until 2.5 years ago, I was a developer evangelist at Salesforce. So I spent 5.5 years in the Salesforce Ohana. So if you want to tweet at me, I'm Metadaddy. And if you want to email me, I'm pat@streamsets.com. So what we're going to be looking at is a use case I actually solved within my company. Users would arrive in our Slack channel, and sales would be really interested in who these users were and getting them into Salesforce. And I'm going to look at two different approaches to doing this. So this is a code-heavy session. Is there anybody here who is not a developer, who is uncomfortable with semicolons and curly braces? Okay, we're going to be looking at some code, so fair disclosure. And just a moment on Streamsets. Streamsets was founded about 4 years ago, and we focus on data integration. So our founders were at Cloudera and Informatica and realized that the current crop of tools there for extract, transform, load, ETL, was very batch-focused and didn't work well with continuous streams of data and big data. So they founded Streamsets. 4 years down the line, we have 50 or so data stores, message queues, and so on we can read-write data to, including Salesforce. We're based just down the road here, and we're over 100 employees now, and 2,000 users in the community that I look after. So we have a Slack team. And does anybody not know what Slack is? Okay, great. So we have a Slack team for our community. Users show up and ask questions and so on. And I had a process where I was creating a CSV file, giving it to somebody to load into Salesforce, and they were just dumping them as leads. And this was very laborious and manual, and it wasn't great quality data because we just had name and email. And Salesforce was constantly out of date by up to 2 weeks, if that was the period I was giving the reports over. What our sales operations team actually wanted was live notifications as users registered for the Slack channel. And to be able to look into Salesforce for a match on email address and just tag an existing lead or contact. And then if I have to create a new one, to actually look at the incoming user's email domain and do a match there so that I don't create some disconnected lead. I actually create a contact on the correct account. And then, of course, we want to post a chatter message saying what's happened. Now, Slack has a very, very nice set of APIs. And one of them is the Events API. And this allows Slack to call your application when something interesting happens. And you configure an endpoint on the web for them to call. So this is what a webhook is. It's very, very simple. It's the endpoint of an application that you've written that you then register with a service for them to call you dynamically when something happens. Okay, when you set one of these up, you basically have a shared secret with the service, in this case Slack. It's a token that they send, so you can be sure that the request is coming from Slack and not some random client out on the internet. And here I was interested in the team join event. So I'm going to get some JSON, a JSON object, when a new user is registered. And that contains their unique user ID. So very like a Salesforce record ID, about 8 or 10 characters. Now the wrinkle is that that notification does not contain their email address. Okay, email address is personal information, it's governed by permission. I have to go back and make a call back out to the Slack to retrieve that data. And another wrinkle is, according to the Slack rules, your app should respond to within 3 seconds. Otherwise, they're going to start retrying. So my first attempt at this was with Node.js. Hands up in the room if you've used Node.js. Okay. Hands up if you've used JavaScript. Great. Node.js, as you probably know, is just JavaScript on the server side. And what I used was a pretty nice library called JSForce. Anybody use JSForce in the room? Yeah, okay, Patrick. This was written by Shinichi Tomita at Mash Matrix in Japan. And it's a very nice piece of work. It wraps most of the Salesforce APIs with a JavaScript interface. And it's isomorphic in that you can use it from the browser, you can use it from Node.js, and it works pretty much the same way. There's some differences in how you get your session ID, but once you've authenticated, the APIs work in exactly the same way. And crucially for me, it wraps the REST API, so I can do create, read, update, delete, query, and so on, and Chatter, because I want to post Chatter notifications. And in order to implement a webhook, your code has to be live on the web somewhere. And I personally did not want to spin up an EC2 box or open up firewall ports, so I pushed it to Heroku, which is just the super easy way to run an application on the web. How many people have used Heroku? Oh yeah, okay, right, you know about it. So, some key techniques here that to pass on. One, never, ever, ever put credentials in your code, usernames, passwords. There's two reasons. One is that when you go from development to test to production, you don't want to be editing your code. The other is that someday you'll email that code to somebody or you'll put it on GitHub and you absolutely don't want those credentials leaking out there. So in Heroku, it's a well-established pattern of using environment variables. I used JavaScript promises. I used a library that supported promises, and JSForce supports promises to avoid the indentation hell of JavaScript. So if you've coded JavaScript at all, you'll know that you code a callback, and then you do something inside the callback, you do something inside the callback, and your code gradually marches across the page. Promises help to unfold all of that. And I used Sossel for searching, and I'll get back into that in a bit more detail. And as I mentioned, the REST and Chatter APIs. So, how many people have used Sossel? A few. How many people have used Sockle? Many more. Okay, so Sossel is Sockel's cousin, and it's really, really useful for this kind of application. Because what we want to do is, given a user's email address, we want to search leads and contacts at the same time. We don't care what we find, whether it's one or the other. We want to search it, and we want to, we can bring back in a single query. So if you look at that first line of code there, we can do, we can find an email address in any email fields, so we don't even have to specify the specific field, and return contacts and leads. And we can even, we can get the ID and other fields. And we can also do things like, if I don't find a match on the email address, I can look for the email domain across all fields. So I can search accounts and contacts to say, does anybody have this domain in their website or their email address or anything? So interestingly, it uses these curly braces as the delimiter when you call from the API. And there's a caveat here. As I discovered, plus signs are legal in the username part of an email, and minus signs are legal in host names, but they're both special characters in Sossel. So you have to make sure you escape those when you use them. Okay, the next tool I used was the REST API. REST API has a special place in my heart. When I joined Salesforce in 2010, the very first job I had was writing the Quick Start guide. So JSForce wraps the REST API and gives you methods to create, read, update, and so on. Very, very straightforward. We just create a JavaScript object. Here I've just created one in line, and you just set up the fields you want. So the JavaScript property names are exactly the same as the Salesforce field names, and they all just get mapped through. And as I mentioned, it uses this promises idea. So instead of passing a callback that we're going to do some handling in, we say then, and then this is the next thing to do. So this stops our code gradually going column by column into the right. And we also have access to the Chatter API. And it's a very rich API. The Chatter API covers obtaining the whole field, posting, commenting, sending marked up messages, and we get access to all of that through JSForce. And then one more component I used. I wanted to go where I found no match on that email domain. I wanted to be able to get company data. I wanted to create a lead, but fill out that company name and just not have it go in as an anonymous lead with like unknown in company name. So I used an API from a company called Kifire that allowed me to pass in the domain. So in this call here, it's website equals acme.com and my API key, and you get back a nice little bit of data here. And you get back the company name, which is really useful. You also get back this is ISP, which is equally useful because if you think about it, if you have users registering with gmail.com, yahoo.com, you don't want Google as their company name. You've just got to punt at that point and just say unknown, but it's good to know that if is ISP is 1 instead of 0, then that's the situation. All right, so enough with the slides. Let's have a quick look at the code. So I have to get out here. I have to capitulate to old age. And okay, let's get to the right piece of code here. Okay, so I'm not going to step through in excruciating details. I'm just going to kind of hit the high points here. So remember I was saying no credentials? Well, we externalize username, password, everything else my app needs into the environment. And then this is the entry point to my application. So I'm receiving a post from Slack, doing the token verification there from the one I loaded from the environment. And really, the action starts just down here. I'm passed in this user object that has an ID. And this is the request with promises library. So this is a really easy way to call an API and get back a JavaScript object. So here I'm saying, okay, Slack, here's my token, here's my user ID, and I want the reply, I want you to parse the JSON. And like you can see here this promises pattern happening. I get a user back from the API, I split it up to get the domain, and then I use JSForce to log into Salesforce. And then again, rather than passing in a callback here to do something when that's succeeded, I have this chain of thens. So do this call, then log into Salesforce, then do the search. So this is where I'm searching and I'm escaping the user's email and I'm returning the contacts and the leads. And then I go down, I parse those out, and there's a bit of business logic here. So really, I'm just looking to see if there's an existing contact and so on. It's not very interesting, but this is the next interesting bit. So if I didn't find a lead or a contact, I check that domain with Kifire, and if it's not an ISP, then I look for the domain in Salesforce. So I'm doing like multiple stages of searching and checking and so on to get down to creating a lead. And as I said, this is super easy. You've just got to set up the fields that you want. And again, you can use promises. So one detail here, I add the lead to a campaign, and then I do the chatter post. And adding somebody to a campaign is just creating a campaign member. But here, here is the next interesting piece, working with chatter. So you create the message as a number of segments. So you can have a piece of text, a piece of markup, so turning bold on, a bit more text here, which is going to be the username. So I've got passing in like some preamble, and then I've got username in bold, and then I can mention somebody in the org here. So if I pass in the record owner, I can add a mention to them. So they just have that @ mention in the body of the chatter message. So let's go and see it working. So what I've done, since Heroku is actually running my live app, nice thing about Node, you can run it in Heroku, you can run it on your local machine. I'm now running my integration app on my laptop, and because all I need to pass in is a Slack ID, I can very easily test it. So I'm using curl here that's just simulating Slack. So this is another great thing about working with webhooks. It's pretty easy to test because you can just use the curl command line HTTP client to pretend to be Slack. And here all I need to do is say, always important to set the content type so it knows you're passing JSON. I've got my Slack token here. I've set it environment, so I'm not going to share it with you. And I'm passing in a user ID. And if I hit that, see, the app comes straight back, and then it's actually performing all this work asynchronously. So I checked the token, I got a user, this is the user response from Slack, so everything came back, logged into Salesforce, and I actually found an existing contact, added it to a campaign, set the Slack ID, and created a feed item. So if I go to my org, so this is the contact that I found. So there's no Slack ID until I refresh the page, but what should happen is that now that I found that user, I set the Slack ID, I set the lead source as well, I think, and I've chatted out a message. So I'm a user as well as the contact in this org. It's my trusty developer edition. But I say I got a mention, contact joined, community Slack as metadaddy. So this is really nice. So somebody joined my my Slack team, and a salesperson gets tagged and told, hey, there's a new user here. You might want to check that account. They're obviously doing a bit more work. So almost as soon as I'd written this, I realized that there was another way of skinning the cat. Who's used Apex REST web services? A few. Oh, quite a few. Okay, so an Apex REST web service is just an Apex method, well, an Apex class with a method, and you annotate it to say the URL where you want the REST method to live, and the HTTP post, HTTP get, whatever, on the handler method. And what you're doing is you're writing some code that receives a REST call across the web. Payload can be XML or JSON, almost invariably JSON these days. And there's one wrinkle. By default, you would need to authenticate to call an Apex REST web service. Now, in common with many other sites on the internet, Slack doesn't know a lot about authenticating to Salesforce. So you can create and set up a Salesforce site, what used to be called a force.com site, to give unauthenticated access to your org. So this gives you a unique domain name that you can actually put code on. And with the 3-second limit, I used the future method so that I wasn't worried about how long it would take to do that search and to create a lead or a contact. I just punted it to the future method. When you do that, when you're calling out to APIs, you have to make sure you set call out true on the method. And add Slack and Kifire to your remote site settings because you'll be calling out to those. So a Salesforce site, you get this site URL that's unique so that any incoming call can get routed to the right org. One thing you'll need to do, I wrote a blog post about this 6 years ago. You can run Apex REST methods in sites. You just need to add that class to the enabled Apex classes. So that basically gives it permission to kind of sit out there on the edge. And in terms of object permissions, we're good with leads and contacts. We can create and read them. You can go through the whole cycle with custom objects, but that's another wrinkle. You can only read and create standard objects. You can't edit or delete them. And always remember to activate your site. This has caught me so many times. You create the site, set everything up, and then you try and call it, and it says it's under maintenance. Okay, so calling Sossel from Apex, it's a little bit different from the API. It's exactly the same syntax there for as Sossel for doing :variable name. You don't have to worry about escaping. You can return multiple types of S-objects. And if you see, it returns a list of lists, which is actually really useful, because if I'm asking for contacts and leads, what actually comes back is a list with a list of contacts and then a list of leads. And you can cast those to the correct type and then just manipulate them as you usually would. So it's a little bit of Apex S-object polymorphism going on. Now, you can call chatter from Apex. This is when I'm kind of secretly glad I'm no longer a Salesforce developer evangelist, because I can say the chatter Apex API is a bit clunky. It was modeled on the REST API, and it kind of shows in the amount of boilerplate code you have to write to get everything done. But you can post to chatter from Apex, but not from a site. So this was the point when I was re-implementing this as an Apex REST method, where I realized maybe I'm running out of tarmac here. Because guest users, so when you call into a site, basically every action that Apex REST method takes is in the context of the site guest user. And guest users are not permitted to post to chatter. And there are workarounds out there. You can create records in a custom object, use schedulable Apex to regularly process the records. And it was just getting too many moving parts. And I didn't want chatter posts happening an hour after the user joined. Other considerations, again, never put credentials, even in your Apex code that lives inside your org, use custom metadata types. Super easy, you just set them up in the setup UI, and then you access them just like a Sossel query. All right, so let's look at some Apex. Okay, so this is an Apex REST method. So again here, it's a lot of parallels with the Node code. What? Every time. Okay, this is in fact the Apex REST method. So a lot of parallels with the Node code. I'm getting my credentials there, the tokens that I need. And then this is where I receive that input. And here, because I'm really only using a couple of fields from the incoming data, I'm just using deserialize untyped to get that JSON into a map. Now, I could create an Apex class that modeled the incoming JSON, but it felt like kind of overkill when I'm just getting the user ID, and I can just navigate through the map here. So I'm checking the token, and then I'm almost immediately punting to this future method. So again, I can't pass any kind of map or anything to a future method, so I just pass the JSON, I deserialize it again, get the user ID, and then I I find the entity. So if I pop down here, where is it now? So again, in Apex, very, very straightforward. Find the email in the emails fields. I get out the data there. And I can return an S object. So this is a useful technique. I'm dealing with either or, a lead or a contact. I can have an Apex method that returns S object that will handle both. I don't need any complexity there. And then once that's returned, in here, I can put the Slack ID on it. So again, I don't need to go kind of cast it to a lead or a contact because I can do that with an S object and do database update, and I'm done. If I don't find it, I'm splitting on the @ sign to get the email, and then I'm doing the callouts down here. So here I'm getting the user here from Slack, and what you'll find is if you do callouts from Apex, there's some boilerplate that you have to do every time. So you create the HTTP object, you create a request at the endpoint. I just always wrap that into a little function there, a little helper function, because I'm always doing the same thing. I'm passing an URL, and I want to get the parsed JSON back. So I go down, I find the entity. This is where I find the entity from the email and pass it back. And then if we go down, I'm getting the company data from Kifire, and it just all follows the same pattern. And then if we pop up back to the main method here, this is Apex 101. Create the contact, create the lead, and then we're done. So if we go across, and of course there's many, many different cases here according to whether it's existing contact, new contact. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new contact in an existing account. So this is a Slack ID of a user with the same email domain as an existing contact. And once I paste it into here, I can do it from here. Once I paste it into here, what you can see is this is the endpoint you'll have to create for your to call your Apex REST service. So I've got the site URL there. Well, actually, this is part of the site URL. Services, Apex REST, and then Webhook was the annotation that I used. So if I call that, so again, it says OK, comes back straight away. And even this should be long enough if I go to contacts, and then it's not in recently viewed, it should be in new this week. So my colleague Dash had an email, dash@Streamsets. Now what you'll notice here is if I go into details, rather than being my user that I use the credentials for, it's the Slack integration site guest user, and sadly, there is no chatter. All right, so simple integration, but it allowed me to explore some different techniques between writing an external application and writing on the platform. And the result was my sales team were pretty happy. They were getting chattered when new users arrived. They were able to see that the customers or prospects they were working with were active in the community, and I didn't have to compile and send CSV files around. So, what should you choose when you're building an integration? You can use virtually any language to call the APIs. There are libraries for Java, Python, Node, pretty much any language. Now, the advantage of writing an external app is that you don't have to set up much in Salesforce. You just have to have user credentials. Typically you create an integration user and lock down the permissions there. So you figure out exactly the perms that your app needs and have a user just for that. You can develop and run on your laptop as well as deploying to somewhere on the web like Heroku. If chatter's important to you, this might be the deal maker. Chatter posts appear instantly when you create them using the API. Now, the downside is you do need credentials, so that's going to burn a Salesforce user. So that's the trade-off there. Apex REST, on the other hand, you have to set up that Salesforce site to allow public access. As I mentioned, most external systems don't know a lot about Salesforce authentication, so you've got to have what's technically an unauthenticated call into the platform and then verify whatever the payload is. So a shared secret, I was checking a token against the token that Slack gave me. It only runs on Salesforce. If you're disconnected on your laptop, you might not be able to work on it. And if you really, jump through all the hoops and post to chatter from code running in a site, there's going to be latency there. You've got to set up that scheduled Apex. But the big upside for running on platform is that you are not having to create that extra user. You're not having to put credentials to your org outside the platform. Of course, both require developer skills, and both require you to pay attention to limits. So you've got API calls coming into your org, whichever. And I think really the developer skills point is probably the key one. That tends to be the governing factor of whether you choose Apex or JavaScript or another programming language. So some resources, I've put the code out on GitHub, on my GitHub here at Slack Salesforce, just in case anybody else might find it useful and compare and contrast there. The Slack Events API, really, really easy to use, easy to work with. I enjoyed that, is at api.slack.com. And yeah, highly recommended if you want to access the APIs from Node.js. JSForce is a really, really nice piece of work. So with that, I'll leave the resources up on screen, and I'll be happy to take any questions. And there's a mic here if you want to run up to the mic. It'll show up on the recording a bit better. Wow, I covered everything in the session. Never happens. Okay, well, thank you very much for attending, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you.